There is a particular kind of silence that people mistake for nothing happening. You wake up, you go through the motions of your day, you do the things you've always done, and yet something in you feels different, not better, not worse, just quieter, unfamiliar. And because nothing dramatic has occurred, you assume you're stuck. What if that's the opposite of the truth? What if the biggest transformation of your life didn't begin this morning or this year, but months ago? In a moment so small, you didn't even mark it. And you simply couldn't see it happening, because it wasn't happening where you were looking. We tend to search for change in the visible world. A new job, a new relationship, a new city, a new routine, a new version of ourselves we can point to and say, "There, that's proof." But the psyche doesn't announce itself that way. It doesn't send a memo. The deepest movements in a person's inner life happen below the surface of awareness, in the dark, long before they ever show up as something you can name. By the end of this video, you'll understand why your life can feel stuck, completely, maddeningly stuck, while something inside you may already be changing, and why that gap between what you feel and what is actually happening might be the most important thing you ever learn about yourself. Let's start with something simple. Change, real change, is almost never visible while it's occurring. Think about how a tree grows. You don't see it happen. You can stand and watch it for an hour, a day, a week, and notice nothing. And yet, months later, it's taller. The growth was real the entire time. It just occurred at a pace and in a register that your eyes weren't built to catch. The human mind works the same way, except it's harder to accept, because we expect our inner life to behave like the outer one. We expect feelings to arrive with headlines, but psychological transformation doesn't move in headlines. It moves in sediment, layer by layer, mostly out of view, until one day you notice that the person looking back at you in the mirror reacts differently to things that used to wreck them. This is the first thing worth sitting with. The absence of visible change is not evidence of stagnation. It might be evidence that the change is happening somewhere you can't directly observe, and that somewhere has a name. Carl Jung spent much of his life studying what he called the unconscious, not as a metaphor, but as an actual, functioning part of the psyche that operates independently of your conscious will. Your conscious mind is the part of you reading these words right now, forming opinions, deciding whether you agree. But underneath that, beneath the reach of your attention, there is a much larger process running continuously, processing experiences, digesting emotions, reorganizing the architecture of who you are. Here is the uncomfortable part. This unconscious process often moves before your conscious mind catches up. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. You might spend a year feeling like nothing is different, while the unconscious has already begun dismantling beliefs you built your identity on. The conscious mind is usually the last to know. This is why people so often say, almost with confusion in their voice, "I don't know what changed, but I'm not the same person I was a year ago." They can't point to the moment. There wasn't one single moment. There was a slow accumulation of internal shifts that only became visible once they crossed a threshold. And by the time they noticed, the transformation was already well underway. So if you feel like nothing has changed, ask yourself a more precise question. Not, has anything happened? But has anything been happening quietly, underneath, without my permission? Now, suffering, nobody wants to hear that suffering has a function. It sounds like something said to people in pain. by those who aren't in it. But Jung didn't see suffering as punishment or as proof that something has gone wrong with your life. He saw it as friction, the necessary resistance that occurs when an old structure inside you is being replaced by a new one. Think of it less like a wound and more like a threshold. When a part of your identity that used to serve you stops fitting, when the old way of coping, the old story you told about yourself, the old relationship to your own fear no longer matches who you're becoming, there's friction. That friction feels like suffering because in a sense it is. Something is being worn away, but it's not being worn away by cruelty. It's being worn away by growth that doesn't yet have language. This reframes a very common experience, the feeling of falling apart right before something shifts. People often describe their hardest periods as the ones immediately preceding a change they couldn't have predicted. That's not coincidence. The old self resists its own dissolution. It clings, and that clinging is what you feel as anguish, restlessness, a sense that the ground beneath you is unstable. The ground is unstable. That's not a malfunction. That's the sign that something underneath is being rebuilt. Here is where most people get lost, and it's worth naming clearly. They mistake silence for failure. You go through a period where nothing external is happening. No breakthroughs, no clarity, just a long stretch of feeling suspended, waiting for something you can't define. And because our culture equates progress with visible motion, you interpret that suspension as evidence that you've failed to move forward. You start to believe you're the exception, that everyone else is progressing while you're frozen. But psychologically, silence is rarely empty. It's often the sound of something too large to be conscious yet. Consider what happens in the natural world during periods that look, from the outside, like nothing. A seed underground, a chrysalis. These aren't images of stillness. They're images of total internal reorganization happening behind a wall you can't see through. The stillness is the cover, not the absence of the process. What if the same is true for you? What if the months where you felt the most stuck were actually the months where the deepest restructuring was taking place, precisely because the noise of everyday striving had finally quieted down enough for something underneath to work undisturbed? Silence isn't always emptiness. Sometimes it's concentration. This slow, often invisible process is what Jung called individuation, the lifelong movement toward becoming the fullest, most integrated version of who you actually are, rather than who you were conditioned to be. It's important to understand what individuation is not. It is not self-improvement in the way we usually mean it, collecting better habits, optimizing your schedule, becoming more impressive. Those things can be part of a life, but they aren't the same as individuation. Individuation is about integration. It's the process of taking the parts of yourself you've hidden, denied, or outgrown, and bringing them into relationship with the person you present to the world. And this is where the shadow enters. The shadow is not evil. It's simply everything about yourself that you've pushed out of conscious awareness because it didn't fit the image you needed to maintain. Of being good, competent, likable, in control. The anger you weren't allowed to express as a child. The ambition you were taught was arrogant. The need for rest you learned to call laziness. All of it goes somewhere. It doesn't disappear. It waits underground, shaping your reactions from a place you can't see. Individuation asks you to meet that shadow, not to be consumed by it, but to recognize it as part of you, and in recognizing it, to become less controlled by it. This is uncomfortable work, And it rarely feels like progress while it's happening. It often feels like regression, like you're becoming less put together, not more. That discomfort is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It's often the exact sign that the process is working. There's a specific kind of experience that tends to accompany this stage, and it deserves its own name: the death of the old identity. Most people think they're losing themselves. What they're actually losing is the version of themselves that no longer fits. Not a literal death, a psychological one. The version of you that organized your life around certain assumptions: I am the responsible one, I am the strong one, I am the one who doesn't need help, starts to lose its grip. And because that identity has been load-bearing for years, sometimes decades, its loosening can feel like losing yourself entirely. This is what's sometimes described, in psychological terms, as ego death. Not the destruction of the self, but the dissolution of a particular rigid construction of self that was never quite the whole truth to begin with. It's disorienting precisely because the ego mistakes itself for the entirety of who you are. When it starts to soften, it interprets that softening as annihilation. But something else is present underneath that fear, something quieter, something that doesn't panic the way the ego does. Call it the self, in the deeper sense, the organizing center of the whole psyche, conscious and unconscious together. That self doesn't die when the old identity does. It's actually what survives it. What emerges afterward isn't a blank space. It's a more honest structure built on more of who you actually are rather than who you were performing. This is symbolic rebirth, not a metaphor for optimism, an accurate description of what tends to happen after a period of internal collapse. The old shape breaks down, and something less defended, less brittle, takes its place. So how do you know if this is happening to you right now, in this ordinary week of your ordinary life? There are signs, and they rarely look like triumph. You may notice that things that used to trigger you barely register anymore. Not because you've suppressed the reaction, but because the reaction genuinely isn't there. You may find yourself with less patience for situations, people, or roles that once felt central to your identity, without being able to explain exactly why. You might feel a strange grief for a version of your life you haven't technically lost yet. Grieving in advance, as though some part of you already knows an ending is coming before the rest of you has caught up. You might also notice an increased sensitivity to your own dishonesty, the small ways you've been performing, pleasing, avoiding. Things you used to do automatically now feel effortful, almost false, because a part of you has stopped believing the performance. None of these are symptoms of something wrong. They're symptoms of integration. The unconscious material is surfacing, asking to be acknowledged, and your conscious life is beginning to reorganize itself around a more accurate picture of who you are. This brings us to something counterintuitive. Uncertainty in this context is often not a warning sign. It's frequently evidence of progress. Certainty is comfortable because it's familiar, even when what you're certain about is your own limitation. I'm just not the kind of person who is a certainty. It's also a cage. When that certainty starts to dissolve, when you genuinely don't know anymore who you are or what you want, it can feel like the ground has disappeared. But a person who has never questioned their own identity has also never revised it. Uncertainty, uncomfortable as it is frequently what it feels like to be between two versions of yourself. No longer fully the old one, not yet consciously the new one. Occasionally, during this in-between period, people notice strange coincidences. a conversation that echoes a private thought, a chance encounter that seems to arrive at precisely the moment it's needed. Jung used the word synchronicity for this, meaningful coincidence that doesn't fit a simple cause and effect explanation, but seems to correspond with what's happening internally. It isn't mystical proof of anything external. It may simply be that when the unconscious is actively reorganizing, you become more attuned, more likely to notice connections that were always there, but that you didn't have the internal readiness to see before. Whether or not these moments carry any deeper significance, their psychological function is the same. They tend to arrive exactly when a person is paying closer attention to their own inner life than usual, which is itself a sign that something is shifting. None of this can be rushed. That might be the hardest part to accept. We live in a culture obsessed with acceleration, 5-step frameworks, 30-day transformations, the promise that if you just try hard enough, change will comply with your timeline. But the unconscious does not operate on a schedule you control. It moves at the pace required by the depth of what it's processing. Trying to force it faster doesn't speed up integration. It usually just produces more resistance, more anxiety, more of that gnawing sense that you're doing something wrong because you can't will yourself into the next version of your life. Learning to trust this process doesn't mean passivity. It doesn't mean waiting indifferently for something to happen to you. It means recognizing that your role is not to manufacture transformation through sheer effort, but to stay honest, to keep looking at what surfaces, even when it's inconvenient, even when it contradicts the story you've told about yourself for years. The work is attention, not force. And slowly, not suddenly, almost never suddenly, a different relationship with yourself begins to take shape. Not because you demanded it, because you stopped interrupting it. So if you're in a season that feels like nothing is moving, if the days blur together, and you can't point to a single thing that's different, consider the possibility that you are not standing still. You may be exactly where a tree is in winter, no visible growth, roots doing work you'll never witness, preparing for something that hasn't announced itself yet. The absence of proof is not the presence of failure. Perhaps you aren't waiting for your life to change. Perhaps quietly, in a place you haven't learned to look yet, it already has. If this video helped you understand something you've been feeling but couldn't explain, subscribe for more explorations into Carl Jung and depth psychology.